These are 48 hours in February 1969 that brought Britain to its knees and left millions without their beloved Coronation Street. What happened during those 2 days wouldn't just paralyze the nation, it would trigger a chain of events that culminated in the collapse of the mighty Emley Moor transmitter mast, one of the most spectacular engineering disasters in British television history. February 1969 was already shaping up to be a month for the record books, with an average temperature of just 0.9 degrees Celsius according to Met Office records. It remains to this day the coldest month recorded in the UK since 1951. That's over 7 decades of brutal winters, harsh freezes, and legendary snowfalls, yet nothing has come close to matching the relentless cold that gripped Britain during those 4 weeks. Not even the infamous Big Freeze of 1962 to 63 could rival the sustained Arctic assault of February 1969. The month had started ominously on February 7th with what meteorologists called a polar low, essentially a mini hurricane of Arctic air that slammed into the East Midlands and Southeast. A foot of snow buried Kent, with drifts towering 20 feet high like frozen mountain ranges across the countryside. But that was just the warm-up act. By February 14th, even central London was buried under several inches of snow. Valentine's Day cards were delivered by postmen trudging through knee-deep powder. Then came February 16, when temperatures plummeted to minus 20 degrees Celsius near Penrith. 2 days later, Grantown-on-Spey recorded an absolutely brutal minus 20.6 degrees. Even central London, usually protected by its urban heat island effect, shivered at minus 7 degrees. But the worst was yet to come. February 19th dawned with an ominous stillness across southern England. Then the wind arrived, savage easterly gales that transformed the existing snow into a weapon. Across South Devon, the combination of hurricane-force winds and driving snow created chaos. Trees that had stood for centuries were ripped from the ground, power lines snapped like guitar strings, roads became impassable rivers of white. The wind wasn't just moving snow, it was sculpting it, carving it into massive drifts that swallowed entire villages. What made this storm particularly vicious was how the easterly gales picked up snow from across the continent and hurled it at Britain like nature's own artillery barrage. The snow didn't just fall. It attacked horizontally, driven by winds that seemed determined to bury everything in their path. One Birmingham resident would later remember standing at a bus stop on the old West End, watching the snow blizzarding down and thinking it was the end of the world. The buses had stopped running because the Bristol road from Longbridge to Northfield had become impassable. Workers were stranded, shops closed early, and families huddled around their fires wondering when it would end. But February 19th was just the opening act. February 20th brought blizzards across the West and Midlands that made the previous day look like a gentle flurry. These weren't the romantic Christmas card snowfalls of childhood memories, these were full-scale Arctic assaults that transformed familiar landscapes into alien white wastelands. The human cost was immense. Emergency services struggled to reach those in need. Farmers lost livestock trapped in the fields. Elderly people, particularly those living alone, faced life-threatening cold in homes where heating systems had failed under the strain. The social fabric that held communities together, the daily routines, the reliable transport, the certainty of electricity and warmth, all of it crumbled under the weight of those 48 hours. Yet perhaps the most telling impact wasn't on roads or power lines or even people's homes. It was on something that by 1969 had become as essential to British life as tea and toast: television. During the height of the storm, ice began forming on VHF and UHF transmission masts across the country. Not ordinary ice, but a thick, glazed coating that accumulated hour by hour, adding tons of weight to structures never designed to bear such loads. At Emley Moor in Yorkshire, home to a 1,265-foot television transmitter mast, workers were already nervous. The locals had nicknamed it the Ice Monster because of its tendency to shed dangerous chunks of ice during winter weather. The mast had only been standing for 3 years, but it had already developed a reputation. The Independent Television Authority had installed warning signs and a flashing amber beacon after complaints from the council about falling ice. Workers at the site wore crash helmets as standard equipment, a precaution that would soon prove prophetic. Similar concerns were already being raised about sister masts at Winter Hill and Belmont, which shared the same ambitious design. During those February days, A senior shift engineer, Brian Glendenning, noticed the ice building up on the guy wires and around the top of the mast. The police had already stopped him earlier that evening, warning about the slippery road surfaces, but nobody, absolutely nobody, thought the mast itself was in danger. The immediate crisis of February 19th and 20th passed as slightly milder air reached the south on the 21st. Roads were cleared, power was restored, and life slowly returned to normal. But the ice remained, clinging to the Emley Moor mast like a frozen parasite, growing heavier with each passing day. For nearly a month, that ice accumulated. Workers continued their routines, wearing their crash helmets, watching for falling chunks, but never imagining the catastrophe building above their heads. The mast had become a ticking time bomb, and the fuse had been lit during those 48 hours in February. Then, at exactly 5:01 p.m. on March 19, 1969, the inevitable happened. Brian Glendenning was in a building next to the mast when he heard what he would later describe as a loud rumbling. Horrific. The 1,265-foot structure, weakened by weeks of ice accumulation and battered by strong winds, simply gave up. The ice monster had finally been slain, but by its own weight. The collapse left millions across Yorkshire and the Midlands without television. In an era when Coronation Street was appointment viewing and families gathered religiously around their sets each evening, this was the disaster of unprecedented proportions. The Leeds duty engineer was inundated with calls from outraged viewers complaining about missing their favourite programmes. Meanwhile, BBC One continued broadcasting from the backup home Moss transmitter, but Yorkshire Television, a brand new company that had only been on air for 8 months, faced a crisis that threatened its very existence. It's difficult to imagine today just how central television had become to British life by 1969. The box in the corner had evolved from a luxury to a necessity, from entertainment to a defining feature of domestic routine. When it disappeared, people felt genuinely lost. The response was as remarkable as the disaster itself. Within 3 days, 17 Polish migrant workers were battling 50-mile-per-hour winds in freezing conditions, working 18-hour shifts to erect a temporary 200-foot mast. Yorkshire Television, hemorrhaging advertising revenue with each hour off air, threw everything they had at restoring service. It was a race against time played out in brutal weather conditions that seemed determined to finish what February had started. The story of those 48 hours in February 1969 is really a story about resilience, both the failure of it and the triumph of it. The weather exposed just how fragile our modern infrastructure really was. A bit of wind, some snow, and temperatures that previous generations would have considered merely uncomfortable brought the country to its knees. But it also revealed something remarkable about British character. Communities pulled together, workers risked their lives to restore services, engineers performed miracles of improvisation under impossible conditions. The same spirit that had rebuilt the country after the war was still there, ready to respond when nature threw its worst punches. Today, February 1969 remains the coldest month on record since 1951. Those temperatures, minus 20.6 degrees in Scotland, minus 13 in Manchester, minus 7 even in London, haven't been matched in over half a century. The 48 hours of February 19th and 20th stand as a reminder of just how quickly our comfortable, predictable world can disappear under a blanket of snow and ice. For those who lived through it, those 2 days remain etched in memory, not just for the cold or the snow, but for the moment when nature reminded Britain that for all our technology and infrastructure, we're still at the mercy of the weather. And sometimes that mercy is in very short supply indeed.